afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Ashley Sullivan, and I work with the marketing team here at Wolf & Company. I'll be your host for today's webinar on the role of the Chief Information Security Officer. Before I introduce today's presenter, I'd like to go over some general housekeeping items. Today's presentation will last about 45 minutes, and the slides can be downloaded at www.wolfandco.com/webinars/2012. If you have any questions at any point throughout the presentation, please send them in to me by using the questions box located on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll answer your questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to send them in throughout the session. You have two options for audio today. You may dial in by phone or listen through your computer. Our audience will be muted during the session, so if you need to communicate with me at any point throughout the presentation, please do so by using the chat box also located on the webinar's control panel. Now I'd like to give a brief background of the firm. Wolf & Company was established in 1911, and we are very excited to have just celebrated our 100th anniversary. Building on our tradition of unparalleled guidance, we provide our clients with assurance, tax, business consulting, and risk management services. We have over 180 professionals working for the firm and have offices in Boston and Springfield, Massachusetts, and Albany, New York. We currently employ over 45 risk management professionals in the areas of IT assurance, internal audit, regulatory compliance, and Wolfpack integrated risk management, and provide services to over 200 financial institutions in 19 different states and 1 U.S. territory. I'd now like to introduce today's presenter, Matt Pavinsky. Matt serves as the director of Wolf's IT Assurance and Security Services Group and is also a member of the firm here at Wolf. Thanks so much for presenting today, Matt, and I'll now hand things over to you.
Thanks, Ashley. I was looking at my picture. I appreciate you photoshopping some hair in there. I feel like we need to do a little bit more work, too. So good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here. Happy to have you join us, and looking forward to what I hope you find is an interesting conversation. I have been personally getting a number of requests from our clients on, what does a Chief Information Security Officer really mean? What do they do? And what we decided to do today was put together a presentation that kind of highlights what that role is. So the good thing is we're going to go at this for the next 45 minutes. We're going to kind of go through, our interpretation of what you as an information security officer should be doing. There's a number of different types of folks on the webinar. I think we got about 130 registered for this afternoon, and they vary between, I saw some presidents, I saw some information security officers, I saw some operations people. So kind of, if you're the information security officer, here's some things that you should think about. If you're senior management, here's some things that you may want to expect of your security officer, or at least provide some sympathy for that role, because it isn't an easy role. There are a few things in the institution that are very static, and there are some things that are just dynamically changing. And I would say IT and the information security field has definitely been changing. So that's what we're going to do. We're not going to go into a lot of detail. There's just not enough time in this presentation to take each piece of those roles and dig deeper. But what I would like to do is have you, at the end of the presentation, you'll get a survey pop up. And this is an opportunity, if there's anything in the presentation that I provide today that you would like to go into deeper, throw it into the survey. That's the communication. That'll tell me and tell us what types of other webinars that we should be holding. So when that survey comes up, don't run out. We'll be done on time. Don't worry. You got your coffee in front of you, I hope. And please fill it out, because it also gives us an idea of where to go with these webinars, if you find them beneficial, if there's other things you want us to do. So we really appreciate you filling out that survey. So that's it. about is just kind of talk about what we envision the role is of this position. And it's interesting. I was able to, I saw a picture of this image the other day, and it kind of gave me the feeling that, I think I have, I'm also the Chief Information Security Officer for the firm here, and the kind of the way that I feel, and it attributed to Star Wars. Now, here's Darth Vader and his band of characters, and I would call this his IT steering committee. He's having their meeting, and they're talking about the threats and things going on in the IT world. And no, I don't believe that banks and CISOs are on the dark side, but even Darth Vader has to have a security officer and has IT, so he's got to worry about this stuff too, right? So they're having the meeting, they're kind of hashing it out, everything's kind of peaceful, things are going well, data's safe, and then what happens? He has a breach, and all of a sudden panic erupts, and the poor CISO is up there, and then all the other folks. I guess you can kind of paint your own picture as far as who Darth Vader is, and maybe who all the guys in the white suits are. If they're the board members, there's senior management, maybe the regulators. But basically, that's what I sometimes feel about the security officer, because there's a lot being done in the background to make sure that data is safe and secure. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, there's no such thing as security as 100%. You don't have enough money to provide for absolute security. You do have enough resources to provide for some assurance, but at the end of the day, something's going to go wrong. And that's what the security officer's role is, not only to provide preventive controls, but also to make sure that there's response going on when something does occur. So that's my little visual of what a CISO sometimes feels like. Many of you have seen this quote. I know I've used it many a time. Some of you may be tired of it, but I do attribute to what a CISO has to think about. And the quote, I won't, usually when I do a live class, I have everybody kind of read the quote. So I won't do that to you this morning or this afternoon. But if you look at it, as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. Donald Rumsfeld, right after 9/11, country wanted to feel like they're safe. They were asking Donald Rumsfeld if he's doing everything in his powers to make sure that something like 9/11 doesn't happen again. And his response was, we're doing what we know, but there's still the unknown. And that's what it's like in the information security and the CISO role. You've got a lot of plans laid out. You've got a lot of controls in place. You've got angry employees that are tired of entering in 14-character passwords. They're tired of being blocked from their online shopping pages, and we're having this battle. And at the end of the day, to protect the institution from more of what I would consider reputation risk than really data theft. We haven't seen a lot of precedent on the side that there's money being stolen other than these commercial cash management systems, which we'll talk about, obviously. But at the end of the day, it's your reputation. People trust you, to keep their money and their information safe. And if you're not going to do it, they're going to go to the next bank. And so we, as the institution, need to make sure we're instilling that trust in our customers. And the CISO has an overall responsibility in helping with that initiative. The CISO is the person that should be strategically planning out, that should be thinking about security, that should be being more strategic about the security initiative, and not being, not being in the weeds per se. But unfortunately, and this is just the law, the nature of it is the fact that a lot of banks can't afford full-time CISOs. The larger banks have full-time security departments, but the community bank, in reality, just can't make that investment at certain sizes. So, we're going to talk about those types of scenarios, and we'll talk about, best practice and then more reality type practice. I think we all know why security is important. Security is often just attributed to making sure that data is safe. I think it gets forgotten that security controls also help make sure of the integrity of the data, make sure that if a transaction occurs, you can figure out who performed that transaction. It makes sure that the systems are running efficiently and effectiveness. So it's just not about compliance. It's just not about keeping Social Security numbers safe. It's about integrity, confidentiality, and availability of the assets, making sure that the systems are there. As I mentioned, we're trying to maintain a level of trust and image. The competition in the community banking space is tough. People are finding ways to move their money, and you don't want to give them any excuse. Stay out of the newspaper. Stay in for what you've been doing well in the communities as a community bank, all the social efforts that you're making. Don't make the papers for a security incident, because at the end of the day, they cost money too. And there are institutions out there that will choose to not upfront the resources and then hope for that something won't go wrong. And as we know, hope is not a strategy. And then lastly, we have the compliance with the regulations. The examiners are still heavily focused on information security. More states are becoming more heavily focused, and I know we have a number of financial institutions on the call today from California and Massachusetts have the toughest state laws, and there's other states that are growing. So at the end of the day, you need a program to attribute all these bullets. And the problem we see in a number of institutions is that there's really no strategic security initiatives going on. It's all reactive, based on either just auditor comments or examiner comments. So we need a program that really can be more like a living document, that when changes to regulation, changes to business environment, changes to threats occur, then the program should be able to easily be tweaked to accommodate for those changes. And that's what the Chief Information Security Officer is supposed to do. So that's why information is important. We're still seeing the breaches occur within both the institutions and your customers. Laptops are still getting lost or stolen. Paper is still being inappropriately disposed of in trash cans. We're still seeing hacking incidents, mostly at your customers, your business customers. Not necessarily seeing a lot of hacking incidents within financial institutions. We're seeing your vendors mess up. We're seeing destruction of the files, again, not being thrown in shredding bins. Backup tapes, thankfully, we're moving to more online SAN environments for backup solutions. At this point, maintaining tapes is getting old, and hopefully you're moving away. And we still have a number of cases where employees have to have access to that information, but unfortunately they're taking advantage of access to that information and they're stealing it. So at the end of the day, if any of these things occur within your institution, your security officer should be able to show that they had controls in place to prevent it. And that makes sure that the court of liability, the financial penalties, will be lower, because we've seen evidence where the government, the Attorney General, will decrease fines and penalties because there was good due diligence, because at the end of the day, they still know that security is not 100%. the fines and penalties go up when there's really no strategic planning. You know, the answer to the question, do you have a security program? Oh yeah, we have passwords. Okay, everybody's got passwords, but that's not a strategic security program. So we need to make sure that due diligence is in place to lower the court of liability and the court of public opinion. Just thinking about the regulations, the presentation today, I obviously pulled a lot of it from the FFIEC guidelines. There's a lot of good information. Unfortunately, a lot of it pertains to larger financial institutions, more perfect world situations. But what we're going to do today is kind of go through those FFIEC guidelines and see if you can come to the middle. We have to come to the middle. There's no way that a $250 million institution is going to hire a full-time information security officer that's going to be completely segregated from management and report directly to the board. We'll talk about that in a second. So we have to come to the middle so we can meet GLBA, we can meet the red flag requirements, we can comply with all the agencies and the different types of rules and regulations and guidance that they're putting out, and then at the same point, the state laws. And the key here is not having a program for each of these bullets. You should have one information security program that handles all of these bullets. Having multiple different programs for different regulatory initiatives causes problems. It creates duplication of efforts. It creates duplication of documents. We got enough documents. So can we build a strategic information security program that surrounds all these bullets in one effort? And again, and that's what a good information security officer will do for you. So as a CISO, and I say CISO, and it has the term officer, you may have a security person who's not an officer in the institution. I'm using the term very liberally. But what are they trying to accomplish? And this is right from the FFIEC guidelines, and I should have apologized earlier on. This presentation is either going to be things you know, and I'm going to help you validate what you're doing, or hopefully there'll be some things you're going to pick up on it that you didn't know, because obviously you probably have other initiatives going on where information security is basically a full-time job for me. But these are the things that you're trying to accomplish as the CISO, making sure that data is available. I won't say at all times, depends on your business impact analysis, depends on how important that data is, but there should be a level of availability, obviously integrity, confidentiality, accountability. You should know if somebody's performing transactions exactly where that transaction is coming from, or if there's something in the system, you know, the integrity or the accountability of that transaction should be there. And then lastly, providing assurance. Providing assurance to senior management, the board, that there is integrity in the data, that controls are in place, that your customer's information is secure, that the transactions and the balances are all there. These are all the things that a good CISO is trying to accomplish. And these should be part of your roles. And that's another important thing, is to make sure that there is a policy, there is a document that describes what the CISO's role should be. And I think we have some samples here. I've seen some samples on the internet. Perhaps maybe that's the next webinar, is, you know, what should that policy look like? But there should definitely be some set expectations to give everyone the opportunity to see what that role should be doing, because the expectations may be different, because they just hear, oh, Chief Information Security Officer, they're doing everything for me in relation to security, when in actuality they may only be making sure antivirus is updated, which obviously isn't the role of a Chief Information Security Officer, but in some organizations that's sometimes how it's defined. So we need to make sure that that does get documented, and there should be some policies in place. We need to make sure that that person is responsible for the program, administering the security program. Some of the institutions have moved to a security committee, where you have a bunch of folks that's responsible for the security program. I think that's fine. There still should be a chair of the committee. There should still be one person in the organization that has overall responsibility, making sure that that committee gets together, that policies are updated, that controls are put in place. There needs to be an accountable person in the environment to move ahead this program. And what they are supposed to be managing, whether it's the committee or this person, is making sure that there's an adequate risk assessment process, the policies are well built, there's testing of policies, and at the end of the day, there's somebody to report security incidents to. And, you know, sadly but true, not only does the security officer need to be proactive with controls, but we also need to develop policies and procedures to respond to incidents, because you know it's going to happen. And it has happened in some of your institutions. And it's a lot easier to respond when you already have some stuff put in place rather than trying to figure out over the weekend, because unfortunately that's usually when it happens, is over the weekend, right? Now there are some responsibilities from the organization about the CISO, you know, and these again are from the FFIEC guidelines. You know, in a perfect world, the CISO has to be completely segregated from the operations. They need to report to the board or senior management, and have enough independence. They should not be a production resource, so they're not the ones that are supposed to be running around fixing the firewall, setting controls on the server, loading the antivirus on the machines. They're the ones that are supposed to be responsible for making sure all that stuff happens. But at the end of the day, if they're in the weeds doing that, it's very easy for them to miss something. It's very easy for them to lose focus on the overall goal. So they need to have authority, they need sufficient knowledge, and have some sort of organizational position. They need a big stick. And I think these are important because I had my daughter draw some diagrams. I say my daughter because she's 6 years old, and I feel like I drew like a 6-year-old right now. I'm not a very good organizational structure drawer. Sorry, Ashley. I may need help next time.
I think it looks good.
So this is the perfect world where the CISO would fit in. They would report directly to the board of directors. They would be a full-time person. They may even be a full-time group. They would have a dotted line to senior management, probably a dotted line to IT. And then the IT department has the security folks. So that CISO's only role is to make sure that all the policies and security programs are in place by doing the testing, as well as thinking about the next threat, keeping an eye on what can affect the institution in the future. What we typically find in our larger community banks, and I'd say these are banks over $750 million, is we have the board and senior management, and then we have the CISO, who is an employee that's somewhat segregated from the IT department, still has to go through a bunch of channels to actually report to the board, doesn't have a lot of pull when something happens, needs to rely on their senior management. And then lastly, we have what's really the reality in a lot of institutions is, you know, the IT guy, whoever that person is deemed the CISO. They have no pull, they have no authority, they're definitely not independent, and they're a million, miles from the board of directors. And this is very common. And I'm not saying that as much as, you know, there may be a nice vision to have this is most likely what's happening, and you have to work with what you got. In small institutions, it's very difficult to afford full-time resources, but you can find, I'll call this person an IT guru, who will keep the institution safe, but a lot of times this person isn't thinking strategically. We don't see a lot of strategic planning going on. We basically just see this person running around putting out fires. So is there a way to maintain this, but still somehow in the senior management area have somebody who can be a little bit more strategic? Now obviously there's experience that is needed. It's a skill, but as much as I'd like to believe that my position is rocket science, it's not. It's a lot of education. It is a lot of training, and it's a lot of reliance on your partners, on your network, on your vendors. But it is possible to kind of push up that role to somebody who's a little bit more strategic in the organization. And the downside is the IT person usually does have all the knowledge and skills, but now you have all your, say, eggs in one basket, per se, and if this person wins the lottery or gets hit by the bus, it's very difficult to replace. So, if you can find a middle where someone in the senior management role can take that position, if you are a smaller institution, like I said, if you're 750 and above, this is what your typical peers look like, where they're hiring full-time security officers that are independent. And then for the larger institutions that we have out here, this is probably very familiar. So I don't have a lot of answers on this other than the fact that we definitely got to move that strategic operations in the senior management area. So as far as the CISO, what they need to do is, I've listed some bullets here. We're going to go through these in a little bit of detail, but again, as I mentioned earlier on, we don't have enough time to go through every bit that's about these bullets. But these are just the things that you need to think about as a true CISO. You need to make sure that there is a risk assessment that classifies and inventories data and systems. Just saying your core processor is your risk assessment says your core processor, your high-risk system is not enough. You need to go through the organization and classify all the types of data and all the types of systems to be able to adequately assess the threats and understand the vulnerabilities, and then making sure that you do have control effectiveness. Again, the CISO, in a perfect world, just collects this data and assesses it. Now, in some of the community banks, there's the CISO is actually doing a lot of the controls, they're doing a lot of the documentation, and that's going to happen, again, a necessary evil. But at the end of the day, you should see a risk assessment that attributes these bullets. You need to have a strategy, and as I mentioned, hope is not a strategy. And a strategy means using a framework. And there are a number, we'll go over a few of the frameworks that we see and that the FFIEC provides, but a lot of institutions that we see aren't following any sort of framework. The security program just keeps getting bolted on based on either auditor comments or regulatory comments and not necessarily following any sort of pattern. And what happens there is by not following a framework, you get legacy controls. You get legacy things that are sitting in that, for 10, 15 years ago, where these frameworks that we'll talk about keep this up to date. And by following a framework, you also can defend your information security program. No one's going to question you for using an industry-accepted program. So it's always good to try to attribute to a framework. This person should be obviously attending security seminars and trainings, always be skeptical that their plan isn't adequate. They should always be thinking outside the box, strategy, and then having resources to rely upon. So here are some of the frameworks that, we see, and the FFIEC stands out. COBIT from ISACA, ITIL. The ISO security standard has a lot of nice guidance, and BIT, which has good information, especially around vendor management, are all good examples of frameworks. NIST has frameworks. There are a series of different ones. Obviously, your biggest framework, which I would call more guidance, is the FFIEC guidelines. But there are even some things in there that need to be interpreted, and these frameworks can help you do that. You need to get education, and we see, a number of folks just trying to hope that they have everything under control. And so the institution really needs to support the CISO in attending regional meetings. I know at SACA, the past president, we have regional seminars, and there's a nice CACS conference. I'm bringing these up as just things that I see out there. So, if you're looking for different types of education, the CACS conference that happens every year around May and April is a good opportunity to learn about security. ISC Squared is the security, has the CISSP, and they're providing more regional meetings. MISTI I don't own any stock in MISTI. I don't make any money from MISTI, but they do have good courses. Again, BankInfo Security, that's a website, good webinars that are out there on that. I have no stock. The RSA conference is another one. Good information, good networking opportunities. We have Black Hat, which is the hacker conference out in Las Vegas. We have folks from our office that go every year. Not exactly the professional crowd that we may be used to when we go to a Mass Bankers Association meeting or some other professional organization, but there's a lot of things being discussed on ways to break into your institution. And so that's just another resource. And then I hope everybody's enjoying and taking advantage of our webinars. And we do an annual in-house training, so around January of every year. We have a week-long training. Last time it was on virtualization security. But we have the webinars that will hopefully keep you updated on the threats that are coming out. But that's the only way to really keep up with these things. To come to what we need to do is where we need to implement the controls. These are your basic control areas. Nothing shocking, nothing new, I'm sure, here. Making sure that your systems and applications have the appropriate access rights administration. Making sure that there's policies around how people are getting added, removed. Making sure the authentication processes are strong. Inside, your internal systems may need different types of authentication than maybe external systems that anybody can access over the internet. Operating, application, remote, physical access. So all these things are the things that you should be thinking about as a security officer and making sure that it's not getting old, making sure you're staying on top, especially the high-risk applications and the network. The CISO is also always responsible for monitoring the program. This is why I get worried when I see a person who's, I will call, in the weeds and doing a lot of the technical stuff like running around, patching systems and applying updates. They don't tend to be able to monitor, the strength of the architecture around the network, taking a step back and looking at how strong the firewall servers, what kind of protocols and walls you have in place. Don't necessarily have time to monitor the activity. The tools for monitoring have come down. It's becoming more, it's becoming easier to buy a technology to monitor all the traffic that's going on your network, to just look at red flags. Still see some institutions trying to pull up the Microsoft Windows logs and look for abnormalities after thousands and thousands of transactions. That just becomes impossible. So keeping up with the conditions of the systems, making sure they're running smoothly, responding appropriately, and then monitoring the outdoor system. The cloud. Well, I think at this point, believe it or not, I believe the cloud has matured enough where it has become, if your institution is looking at a system that it proclaims to be on the cloud, your vendor management program should be able to handle it. There's still little quirks and things that regulators might not like, or there may be some things that you're not going to get in a contract. But if you have a strong vendor management program, then you should be able to move to these, what I'll call more efficient, tends to be cheaper, and tend to be more highly available outdoor systems. We had a question the other day about the potential for a bank was interested in moving their email to a hosted solution, and there are vendors providing that. There was a bank in Spain who went and move, rather than using Microsoft Office, they're using Google Apps. I think that's a little extreme, but they're doing it. So people are finding efficient ways to use the cloud, and I still just call it, I still consider it just software as a service, just like what we're used to. But if the vendors want to use the fancy name, the cloud, to get more clients, great, let them do it. And then lastly, typically we see the CISO, maybe the security programs, like updated once a year. It's got to go in front of the board. Let me spend a few days before the board meeting to see if all the names are still correct in the program, see if the system names are right, but not necessarily kind of taking a step back and making sure that it's really addressing any new threats or vulnerabilities. And unfortunately, that means it's becoming stale and effective. And so the CISO really needs to have ways to monitor the program and treat it like it's dynamic. And this is, again, not anything new, but unfortunately in the smaller institutions, we're seeing trouble. They're having a hard time keeping up with all the new vulnerabilities and threats and keeping it dynamic. But when that happens, you definitely see the number of incidents go down and systems actually run smoother. If your IT folks are spending a lot of time putting out fires, then most likely there's probably not a good governance program that's over there. So a good security program, dynamic security program, can definitely help with that. So that's the kind of things as far as the roles of the CISO. What I also wanted to do during this presentation is just to discuss some things that you should be keeping an eye on if that is your role. And I have a bullet list of things that are the hot topics of the year, basically. So what do you need to worry about? You need to worry about the social engineering aspect. So people are social engineering or phishing your customers, but more importantly, the hackers are getting smarter. They're not trying to break into systems anymore. Well, they still are. I shouldn't say anymore. But it's easier to get into your institution's network through your employees. So your employees are getting emails with viruses and links to bad websites. Sometimes it's just very open and generic emails. Sometimes they're being very targeted. There's a lot of money being made for folks over in China and Europe, where the culture in some of the areas is that Americans are rich, and it's okay to steal from us. So there's a lot of incentive for folks to make a living just by specifically spending time targeting your institution, and you're not too small. Obviously, Bank of America and the big guys, they have people target them all the time. But we've seen a number of attacks at the smaller organization because the feeling is they probably don't have as many controls as the big ones. So at the end of the day, we need to educate your employees to be aware that these types of attacks are occurring, where it's not just about system attacks, but it's actually about them being approached. And that's why the CISO is very responsible for the security awareness program. And that's another thing that I think we can enhance across the environment. I see a number of information security awareness programs that, it's a half-hour presentation. The person just kind of clicks through the answers and doesn't really get a lot out of it. So is there a way to do at least something once a year that they'll come away with going, wow, I can really help the institution? And then throughout the year, there needs to be constant pings. There needs to be constant reminders about their role. So, and that's another thing we tend to not see. Fortunately, we moved away from just the new hires getting security training to almost everybody at least once a year. But it's usually just once a year. It's really quick. They sign off and agree, but they don't really know what they read or understand. So we need to do a better job at educating them. We need to do a better job, especially the regulators are focused on the board presentations. It it's not okay for the board to throw their hands up and say, we just don't understand this. We need to educate them. We need to give them metrics and things to determine if the health of their system. We need to keep our eyes on the online commercial multi-factor authentication. We're still seeing breaches in wire transfers where companies are getting their bank accounts wiped out. And granted, most of these situations were large institutions where people were not involved, but we have seen some cases where even though an employee was in the middle of the transaction, they still fell for it, and the wire happened. So just because you're not using an online cash management system, or you do, but you think an employee is still involved, doesn't mean that it's not prone to fraud. And you need to have that as part of your security program. We're seeing more back office fraud monitoring software. The core providers are coming out with their own modules. It's coming to the point where if you're not monitoring thousands of transactions for red flags, looking for unusual transactions or what may be inappropriate transactions, you're going to get criticized. The technology is becoming reasonable to purchase, and at the end of the day, we're hoping that our customers don't give up their credentials. We're hoping that they protect their information, but we've seen court cases where they haven't. They've sued the institutions and they've won. You know, we've seen other court cases where they sued the institutions and they lost, so there's really not a lot of precedent. But we need to be doing more office fraud transaction monitoring, vendor management. As I mentioned earlier, you know, cloud computing is more prevalent now. When you're outsourcing your system, most likely it's going to be on some sort of version of a cloud environment, and it's really up to you to understand what type of cloud environment it is, how the data is being stored. Is there ways to encrypt the data so that even though your data is mingled with other people's data, at least it's encrypted so it can't be read except for anybody without, you know, with your authorizations. We're very focused on third-party apps. Everybody's doing an awesome job at Microsoft patching and updating, but unfortunately now the hackers are going through Adobe, they're going through Java, they're going through these third-party apps. They're easier to get through because you most likely have a person running around the institution trying to keep them updated. So the CISO should really be evaluating the use of strong third-party patch management systems. What's this? The WSUS system isn't enough anymore. And then lastly, the hot topic, the big thing that should be on your radar, obviously, is mobile device management. And just this morning, there was a story about BlackBerry, and they've lost another 9% of their shares. They lost 98% of their shares since 2008. They're unfortunately, I think, the best company for a financial institution to manage mobile devices, to issue mobile devices, but the rest of the world doesn't think so. And you have to plan for the fact, or not for the fact, but you have to plan for the potential that BlackBerry may not be around in a few years. And if that's how you're distributing your mobile devices, you need to focus on mobile device management software. You need to start warming up to the idea that an employee is going to want to attach their iPhone to your network. And there are ways to protect it. There are ways to make sure that that's okay, but you need to do some research on that. The other thing is, I don't think it's a good idea to say no. I mean, people are becoming more productive when they're bringing their own devices in. And I think we need to hone in on that. We need to take advantage of that. We need to show support of that. But at the same point, you know, we have to make sure they understand that they're putting the institution at jeopardy by losing the device or having it broken into. So that's another thing that, you know, the CISO is coming down. So just some ideas. You know, we'll probably do this on an annual basis with a webinar. So if you don't have time during the year to kind of, when you're going in and looking at your information security program, we'll bring up some bullets like this so you can kind of do that threat analysis of what's going on. And I'd love to hear if you have if there's anything I missed in this list, feel free to add that to Ashley's list. I'd love to hear about it, or if there's anything I missed in this presentation that you have been responsible for that you'd like to share with others. Lastly, I need, as a CISO here, I always want to keep updated, so making sure I stay informed with the regulatory letters. I know we try to do this with the Banking Tech Connection. Some of you are getting this weekly email that comes out on Tuesday morning, and basically it's a synopsis of the previous week's articles and things that occurred, whether or not it was a new FIL, a new breach, or just some news about the banking tech industry. So if you're not getting that email and you think you're interested, please send me an email or send Ashley an email, and we'll get you on the list. There's a number of bank technology websites that I definitely keep an eye on. The four here are pretty good at feeling like I'm staying informed. And lastly, Twitter. I know a lot of folks aren't on Twitter, and I know a lot of folks think it's a waste of time. And I probably would agree, for 95% of the transactions that occur on Twitter are probably a waste of time. But if you set it up right, so I've set up my Twitter account so that I'm only following people in my profession, and they're only posting things that are related to our profession. So I don't feel like I'm out of touch. I don't feel like I'm missing something. I feel like I'm seeing the worst of it, and that gives me a sense when we go to our clients that we're providing you with what's going on recently. So just some good ways to stay informed. Again, another expectation from the regulators. They're going to want to see that you're doing all these things that I mentioned in this webinar in some form or fashion, because we have seen comments or criticism where the poor person who was assigned the role really didn't understand what the role meant and thought that it meant just making sure that there was passwords or making sure antivirus was on the network. So these folks, these are the things that what the true role really looks like. So the end, I promise to keep this within the time frame. As I always say, unfortunately, security is never 100%, but you set up as many roadblocks as possible, and a good security program will do that. The CISO really should promote the role. Don't be a hindrance. Try not to look like a hindrance to your employees. Try to educate on why you're trying to protect them and their job. They don't want to be the person that downloads the virus. It's very embarrassing. They don't want to be the person that loses the laptop. It's very embarrassing. Let them know that you're trying to not only protect the institution, but you're trying to protect them. And then lastly, try to be more of a security strategist. Try to move away from the box. Think outside the box. Look around. Spend a day kind of thinking about other things that might happen to your organization and be proactive rather than reactive. You're going to get good feedback already from, the auditors. You'll hopefully get good feedback from the auditors. You'll hopefully get good feedback from the regulators. And you use that information as well as staying on top, and it can be done. You could be a security strategist. I listed some resources that you can obviously go to from the webinar. I listed some earlier. Here's some other ones. And as always, I hope to be a resource to you. So if you have any questions outside of this presentation, there's my phone, there's my email, there's my Twitter account, there's my LinkedIn account. Let me know, and I'd be happy to help. So Ashley.
Great.
I'm done.
So we do have a few questions that have come in already, but if anyone hasn't sent their question in, please do so now. If we do run out of time, Matt will follow up with you directly. So don't be shy. Keep the questions coming. And I just want to also highlight, if anyone is on Twitter and isn't following Matt, I would say that's the most valuable resource on here.
I'm the best Twitterer.
He is. He's the best tweeter. And he's constantly updating his Twitter with all relevant IT security articles. So I highly recommend you do that. So on to questions for Matt. Matt, who does the CISO typically report to?
So in larger organizations, I would say that role typically is segregated out in reporting most likely to the CFO or the COO, a couple of situations to the CEO, but most of the time it's either reporting to the IT manager or the CIO. If it's a really small institution, it may be the CFO or the CEO, but a lot of times the CISO definitely reports to the CFO or COO. I would characterize that. Not exactly what the FFIEC guidelines kind of want, but that's, I think, the more realistic role for a community institution.
Great. Any ideas on how to pitch the importance of training to my CFO? It's a really hard sell.
So I'm going to assume you mean training is your own personal training, to make sure that you're keeping up to date. And do I have any ideas? I think it's similar to their role. I know that they go, to a number of association meetings. They go to a number of trainings where they're trying to keep updated. And a lot of times it's trying to convince them that this is an always changing environment. I know I have a number of discussions with senior management and board members about when I do see a lack of training going on in the institution for the CISO and trying to support that. But at the end of the day, is there a perfect scenario? I think I may have to think about that, but I don't know any off the top of my head, other than the fact of just trying to educate them on the 3 million things going wrong. Because at the end of the day, it's hard. It's like if things go wrong, then you're at fault, but that's because you didn't go to this training because you didn't get the resources to go to the training. So it's unfortunately an unfortunate circle of life.
Great. How does the CISO compare to the Director of Risk or Internal Audit or the CIO?
Great question. So what we're seeing now is this risk officer title. And the risk officer is developing its own little tree underneath where we have institutions where the risk officer has the information security underneath them, internal audit, compliance. So basically the CISO is sometimes a component of that risk officer group or that risk group. The CIO is really the person who's making sure that, it's directly related to making sure that the systems are running. And they have to be strategists too. They have to make sure that they're supporting the business objectives of the bank, the strategic plan of the bank. And that's mostly what they're focusing on. So what the CISO does is kind of helps them sleep at night. So as they're trying to get the bank where it needs to be technology-wise, the CISO is providing observation and guidance to make sure that they're not putting the bank at risk. So I treat the position as somebody, kind of another set of eyes, and then the chief risk officer is kind of putting all that stuff together, making sure that risk assessments, making sure that control, making sure that education is centralized, is common, and that happens in very large organizations where this risk officer may be responsible for all those things. So that's really the difference, I guess.
Great.
I wouldn't say I guess. I should know, right?
And this is probably a question that every small bank has, but with risk and compliance being a focus of the regulators, what is the best way for smaller banks to cover all positions, CISO, CRO, Chief Compliance Officer, and still do banking?
Why would you want to keep doing banking? And that all those other things can be so much more fun, right? Now, the good thing about a smaller, the downside is you have the same amount of regulation. The good thing about the community bank is the number of people, the number of controls. There's obviously they're less than what a large institution is. A lot of times it's just a matter of sharing the responsibility. So it's impossible for a small community bank to have one person to handle everything. So we need to share the wealth. We need to make the CISO a part of one person's job, the compliance a part of another person's job. And I know this is probably common sense. That's my only answer. I'm sticking to it. But having that risk committee, so having those people get together on a quarterly basis or a monthly basis to make sure things are in line helps, because the discussions at the table will help. And at the end of the day, that's what we see most of the community banks doing. The CISO is the IT person. The chief compliance officer is sometimes the head of operations, because they just can't afford that. But what about supplying support underneath? So if your head of IT is your chief security officer, it's probably not effective to go out and pay for another full-time employee to be a chief security officer. But does that head of IT have enough resources so they're not running around fixing printers and fixing computers? Can you delegate? Can you give them resources that may be a little cheaper to delegate those responsibilities and make their life a little easier so that they can continue to bank?
Great. Well, that is actually all the time we have. We do have a few questions that Matt didn't get to answer, so he will follow up with the audience with the answers to those questions following the webinar. And as a reminder to everyone, this presentation can be downloaded at www.wolfandco.com/webinars/2012. And I'll be posting a recording of this webinar to that same web address following the conclusion of this webinar. And as a reminder, as Matt mentioned, when you do exit the webinar, you will be prompted to fill out a survey. So please do so. We appreciate your feedback so we can continue to improve our webinar program. I want to thank Matt for presenting today and thank our audience for attending. We look forward to all of your participation in future webinars. And have a great afternoon, everyone.